Imagine being called a snitch just for doing your work. Imagine your entire class turning against you, whispering behind your back, while the real problem walks away like he's the victim. That's what happened to me, all because of my lab partner. I walked into the chemistry lab with my notebook tucked against my chest and the faint smell of ethanol and chalk dust hanging in the air. Our professor, Dr. Mara, had assigned partners last week, and to my surprise, my name was paired with Rohan. Everyone in class knew him as the funny, laid-back guy who never really took things seriously. He was charming, sure, but in a careless way that often irritated teachers. I kept telling myself, maybe he would try harder in lab work because experiments weren't jokes. They needed focus, but the moment I saw him lounging against the counter twirling a pen, I knew this would be harder than I imagined. We were supposed to start with titration, a basic exercise to test accuracy and patience. I had already set up the burette and pipette, carefully checking for air bubbles, while Rohan strolled in 10 minutes late, grinning like nothing had happened. "Hey, partner," he said, sliding onto the stool beside me. "What did I miss?" I wanted to snap at him, but I swallowed the irritation instead. "Just the setup," I replied, trying to keep my tone neutral. "Great," he said, without even glancing at the apparatus. He pulled out his phone and began scrolling. I stared at him, waiting for him to notice my silence, but he didn't. I sighed, picked up the flask, and began measuring. Halfway through the experiment, when the pink color faintly flickered at the edge of the flask, he leaned over. "So how many drops do I add?" he asked, as if he had been watching all along. "None," I muttered. "I already finished the first trial." "Oh, cool," he said, scribbling something in his notebook without even checking. I peered over and saw he was literally copying my readings word for word. My throat tightened, but I said nothing, because it was just the first day. Maybe he was nervous. Maybe he'd try later. At the end of class, he beamed. "Thanks for doing the heavy lifting. I'll catch up next time." I forced a smile, but my stomach twisted. Something told me this was not going to be a one-time thing. That night, I sat at my desk replaying the day's events, the way his eyes darted quickly to my notes, the way he brushed off responsibility with charm. I should have said something, but I didn't. Maybe because confrontation scared me, maybe because I wanted to believe people could change, but deep down I already knew I was setting myself up for disappointment. Would you have confronted Rohan right away? The next lab came faster than I expected. I had prepared my notebook, neatly outlining the A materials procedure and expected results because that was how I functioned. Clarity made me feel in control when I reached the bench. Rohan was already there this time. Surprisingly early, I felt a tiny surge of relief. Maybe he was taking this seriously after all. But the relief evaporated when I saw what he was doing. He had pulled out a packet of chips and was munching carelessly near the glassware crumbs, scattering dangerously close to the flasks. "Hey," I warned him, "keep that away from the table." He rolled his eyes. "Chill. I'm hungry. I'll help in a bit." The bit never came, while I carefully measured solutions, adjusted burners, and recorded observations. He leaned back, telling me stories about how boring the professor's lectures were and how he only joined this course because it fit his schedule. I nodded, distracted, but my pen moved furiously across the page. Every number mattered, and I wanted my results precise. By the end of the session, I had completed 3 trials alone. Rohan looked at my notebook, impressed. "Wow, you're like a machine. You know, I can just copy from you, right? Saves us both time." I froze. The casualness of his tone stung. It wasn't even a request, it was an expectation. "No, you should write your own," I said firmly, but he laughed. "Come on, we're partners. What's mine is yours. What's yours is mine, right?" He winked, and before I could protest, he had already begun scribbling. I felt heat rise to my cheeks, but I bit down my frustration, because what was I supposed to do? Make a scene in front of everyone? My classmates were focused on their own work. No one noticed, except maybe Neha from the next bench, who gave me a sympathetic look. That night, as I studied the lab manual for the next week's experiment, a thought kept gnawing at me. If he never contributes and keeps copying, how will this affect my grades? Because our submissions were joint. And what if he made mistakes and dragged me down? The more I thought about it, the heavier my chest felt. By the third lab, the pattern was clear. I did everything. He copied everything, and then he left. Whistling like his day had been productive, my patience wore thinner each time, but the fear of being labeled difficult kept me silent. I remembered whispers from earlier semesters when a girl had reported her partner for slacking. Everyone had called her a tattletale, and she became isolated. I didn't want that. Still, something inside me whispered, maybe silence wasn't protecting me. Maybe it was only protecting him. What would you do if your partner expected to copy your work every time? The following week, I promised myself I would speak up. If things repeated the same way, I walked into the lab with my notebook pressed against my chest, rehearsing different ways to tell him firmly that he needed to do his part. When I reached our bench, Rohan was nowhere in sight again by the time the professor finished explaining the experiment. He strolled in humming, with not even a pen in his hand. "Late again," I muttered, but loud enough for him to hear. He grinned traffic. He shrugged like that, excused everything. I decided to test him. I handed him the manual and said, "You handle the first step today, I'll write the observations." He blinked at the page, frowned, and said, "Can you just start it off? I'll jump in later." I felt irritation prickle across my skin. Later never came. He leaned against the counter and started chatting with the group behind us, cracking jokes while I carefully balanced reagents. Halfway through the experiment, he leaned over me, whispering, "Hey, did you already calculate the molarity? I need to copy that?" I turned sharply. "This is supposed to be teamwork, not copy work." He gave me a look like I was overreacting. "Don't be so uptight. Everyone does this." I glanced around, but most people were busy with their own tasks. I clenched my jaw, writing faster. By cleanup time, I had done everything again, and he scribbled a few lines at the end of the notebook, so it looked like he had contributed. I didn't bother correcting him. My anger was a heavy lump sitting in my chest on the way out. He said casually, "Hey, you'll send me a photo of the results tonight, right? I need to finish the report." I stopped walking. "No," I said firmly. "You'll write your own notes." He laughed. "Wow, harsh." That night, I lay awake replaying his smug grin over and over. I realized something important. The more I tolerated, the more he took. I wasn't just tired. I felt invisible, like my hard work didn't even belong to me anymore. The next lab was the breaking point. Rohan showed up without even pretending this time. No notebook, no pen, nothing. He leaned over the bench, fiddling with his phone while I struggled with a tricky titration. My hand shook slightly with the burette drop by drop. The solution turned pale pink, my focus sharp, but when he suddenly asked me, "Hey, so what result are we supposed to get?" I nearly dropped the glass. I snapped, "If you don't even care, why are you here?" His face hardened for a second, then he smirked, "Because you'll do it anyway." That was when I knew silence had turned into surrender, and I couldn't keep surrendering not anymore. Have you ever worked with someone who relied entirely on you? The morning of the next lab, my stomach churned with nervous energy. I had reached a decision. After sleepless nights, if Rohan continued to slack, I would talk to the professor quietly after class. I reminded myself this wasn't about tattling. This was about fairness, about protecting my own grade. Sure enough, he arrived late again, and within minutes, he was scrolling on his phone while I set up the experiment. My patience had snapped like a frayed string. I worked silently, but my chest felt tight. Each pipette, each calculation fueled my decision further. I kept imagining my name tied to his laziness, and it burned. When class ended, I lingered while most students packed their bags. The professor looked up from his desk. "Yes, something you need." I walked forward, my voice steadier than I felt. "I just wanted to let you know, I've been doing most of the work alone. My partner hasn't been contributing, and I'm worried it'll affect our grade." The professor adjusted his glasses and sighed. "This isn't the first time I've heard this about him. Thank you for telling me. I'll address it." I nodded, relief flooding through me, but also fear. What if Rohan found out? He did find out the very next day, storming up to me in the hallway. "So you went and told Sir behind my back." His voice dripped with anger. People nearby turned their heads. I stiffened. "I just told the truth. If you'd been working there, would have been nothing to tell." His lips curled. "Wow, so now you're a snitch," he said loud enough for half the class to hear. The word echoed in my ears, and like a ripple in water, the whispers spread. By the time lecture started, I could feel the weight of eyes on me. Classmates glanced, exchanged looks, some smirked, others frowned. The air felt thicker, heavier. At the end of class, I overheard someone mutter, "Careful, she might run to the professor again." My cheeks burned. Humiliation pressed down on me. Harder than Rohan's laziness ever had, I had stood up for myself, and instead of support, I was branded. That evening, I sat in my dorm, staring at my notes, unable to focus my phone, buzzed with a text from Neha. "Don't let them get to you, you did the right thing." I read it twice, clinging to those words like a lifeline. Maybe the label would fade, maybe fairness would finally win out, but for now, the isolation stung more sharply than I expected. Still deep down, I knew I wouldn't take it back. I had chosen truth over silence, and though it hurt, maybe it was the only path forward. Have you ever been called a snitch just for telling the truth? The next few days felt like walking through a storm with no umbrella. Whenever I entered the lecture hall, conversations seemed to pause, just slightly enough for me to notice. When I sat down, some students shifted away casually, but deliberately. It was like an invisible wall had formed between me and the rest of the class. During lab, the silence was louder than the clinking glassware. Nobody asked me questions. Nobody partnered with me for quick checks. Even Neha looked nervous about being too close, though she still offered small smiles. Rohan, of course, played the victim loudly, sighing about how unfair professors could be and how some people just didn't know how to be good partners. Every word dripped with poison, and though he never said my name, everyone knew who he meant. One afternoon, as I walked across the quad, I overheard two classmates behind me whispering, "It's not even that big a deal. Why couldn't she just let him copy a little?" I felt my chest tighten, but I kept walking, my hands curled into fists inside my pockets. It amazed me how quickly the narrative had flipped. He was lazy, yet I was the villain. Assignments piled up, and I worked harder, determined not to let the pressure sink my grades still. The loneliness weighed, heavy lunches felt quieter, hallways, longer, even casual group chats about study sessions somehow excluded me. The sting of being left out was sharper than I had expected. In lab, the professor began hovering more often near our bench. Watching carefully, he would occasionally ask Rohan to demonstrate a step, and when he failed, it was obvious. Yet somehow the sympathy still flowed his way. Classmates murmured, "Poor guy," instead of "poor me." I couldn't decide if I was invisible or simply disliked. One day during cleanup, I accidentally dropped a beaker. The sharp crash echoed across the room instantly. Rohan snorted loud enough for everyone to hear. "Careful, snitch. Don't want to report yourself for breaking glass." The room erupted in stifled chuckles. My face burned hot as I bent to clean the shards, my hands trembling. The professor frowned but didn't say much. That night back in my dorm, I stared at my reflection in the mirror. My eyes red-rimmed from tears. I asked myself, was I overreacting? Had I really done the wrong thing? But deep down, I knew the answer. No, I hadn't. This wasn't about betrayal. This was about accountability still. It didn't make the isolation easier. Then a thought flickered. Maybe I didn't need their approval. Maybe I needed to focus on my own integrity, but part of me still wondered if I could ever escape this label. Would you rather be isolated for standing up for yourself or stay silent and keep friends? Days blurred together with the same rhythm of whispers and cold stares, but slowly cracks began to show in the wall around me. One afternoon during lecture, the professor announced a surprise quiz. Everyone groaned except me. I liked being tested. It felt fair and straightforward. When the papers were handed back, I had scored near the top. Rohan, meanwhile, barely scraped a pass. The professor raised his eyebrows as he handed the sheets back. Clearly unimpressed murmurs rippled through the room, but this time I caught something different. Admiration from a few classmates. I heard someone whisper, "She's actually smart." Not just a tattler for the first time in weeks, my chest felt a little lighter. Later that day, Neha slid into the seat beside me during break. She lowered her voice. "Don't listen to them seriously. Everyone knows he's lazy." She nudged me gently and smiled, small but genuine. It was like someone had cracked a window in a suffocating room. I whispered back, "Thanks." The following lab confirmed what I already knew. Rohan hadn't changed. He shuffled in late again, and when the professor deliberately asked him to perform a titration, he fumbled, spilling half the solution. Classmates chuckled, but this time it wasn't directed at me, it was directed at him. I stood quietly recording results, feeling a quiet satisfaction. When class ended, two students approached me hesitantly. "Hey, could you explain how you balanced that equation? I saw your notes and they looked really clear." I blinked, surprised, but quickly nodded. Of course, for 20 minutes. I walked them through the steps. Their eyes widened as understanding dawned. Thank you, one said. You make it so easy to get. So easy to. Suddenly, I felt like maybe my hard work wasn't invisible after all. That night, my phone buzzed with a message from Neha again. Some people are starting to realize he's the problem. Not you, just hang in there. I smiled at the screen. Maybe she was right. Maybe the tide was turning. The next day in the cafeteria, Rohan passed my table muttering still a snitch under his breath, but I didn't flinch. I simply kept eating, and when I looked up, I saw one of the students. I had helped glaring at him instead. It was small, but it mattered. For the first time, I wasn't completely alone. I realized then that respect wasn't about being liked by everyone. It was about consistency. The more I stood firm, the more the truth slowly revealed itself. People could call me names, but they couldn't erase my effort. Have you ever noticed that hard work eventually exposes laziness without you saying a word? The fragile calm didn't last long. Once Rohan sensed the shift, he doubled down on his performance. He started telling louder stories in the cafeteria about how unfair professors were, how partners like me ruined teamwork, how some people only cared about grades, not friendship. His voice always carried just far enough for me to hear. In lab, he became reckless, deliberately bumping my elbow while I measured solutions. Oops, he'd say with a smirk. Classmates laughed nervously, but I caught a few eyes rolling now. Not everyone was buying his act anymore. Still, the constant interference made my work harder. I had to redo an entire set of readings because of one of his accidents. One afternoon, he escalated further as we prepared for submission week. He cornered me in the hallway, smirking. I know you're writing the report already. Just save us both time and email it to me. I took a deep breath. No, you'll write your own. He leaned in closer. You don't want to make more enemies, trust me. I froze for a second, then forced myself to step back firmly, my voice steady. You already made yourself the enemy, not me. His eyes narrowed for a split second. Then he laughed loud and mocking, walking away. But my heart hammered the whole evening. His words replayed on a loop, the weight of his threat heavy. The next lab proved his desperation. The professor assigned us individual tasks to ensure fairness. I completed mine carefully, but when it came time to combine results, Rohan suddenly raised his hand. Sir, she didn't let me contribute. She hogged the experiment. My mouth fell open. That's not true. I began, but the room filled with murmurs. The professor frowned, looking between us and said calmly, that's not what I observed. She carried most of the work because you weren't paying attention. Rohan's face reddened. Classmates glanced at each other, and for the first time, I saw doubt spreading about his narrative. Still, the sting lingered as we packed up. He muttered under his breath, careful snitch. You think this ends with one lab report, you'll see. I kept my back straight, but inside I was shaking. Was he bluffing? Or did he really plan something? That night, Neha called me. She had overheard his outburst and told me firmly, don't back down. He's losing grip. That's why he's acting out. Her words steadied me, but sleep still evaded me. My mind replayed every whisper, every smirk, every threat until dawn. Deep inside, though I knew something had shifted, he was desperate because he was losing control. Maybe this was the beginning of the end. How would you handle it if someone started spreading lies about you publicly? The next week started with a quiet shift. I noticed fewer stares, fewer whispers when I entered class. Maybe people were getting tired of Rohan's drama, or maybe the professor's words had carried weight. Either way, the silence felt different, lighter. During lab, the professor assigned us independent sections again. I focused on my titrations. Steady hands, deliberate pace. When Rohan leaned over with a fake casual tone. Hey, can you give me your numbers? I want to double check. I didn't even look up. No, you need to record your own. He smirked loud enough for others to hear. Wow, she's still bossy. But this time, instead of laughter, I caught two students frowning at him. One even muttered under their breath. Seriously, dude, do your own work. It was small but powerful. The tide was turning. Later in the cafeteria, Neha slid her tray next to mine. She whispered, have you noticed people are getting annoyed with him? I nodded. Relief softening my shoulders, she grinned. Maybe you won't have to do anything. His own behavior is sinking him. I wanted to believe that the real turning point came during submission week. We had to turn in our reports individually, though based on joint results. I submitted mine neatly detailed with clear graphs and analysis. Rohan turned his in late and sloppy. When the professor returned them with grades, mine was marked with a proud 90, while his barely scraped 50. The class buzzed with whispers. One student even asked out loud, how come your grades are so different if you're partners? The professor answered, simply because one of you did the work and the other did not. Rohan's jaw clenched. His eyes darted around the room as though searching for sympathy, but none came this time. Classmates avoided his gaze, some smirked. Others looked annoyed. Suddenly the narrative of me being the snitch seemed flimsy. That afternoon as I left the lecture hall, a boy from another bench caught up with me. Hey, I know things have been rough, but you were right to speak up. He said quickly, just wanted you to know. I blinked at him, taken aback, but gratitude swelled in my chest. Thank you, I whispered. And for the first time in weeks, my smile felt real. Of course, Rohan didn't stop. He muttered comments whenever he passed me in hallways, still trying to sting me, but the words had lost power without an audience. His smirks looked hollow, his threats weak. I began to realize something important. His control had only existed because others believed his story now. That cracks had formed, his hold was slipping. That night, I sat at my desk writing notes with steady hands for the first time. I felt like the balance was shifting back to me. Have you ever seen someone's lies unravel just because the truth was too obvious? By the time mid-semester reviews came around, I felt like I was breathing new air. The stares had faded. The whispers were softer, almost gone. Even walking into the lab didn't make my chest tighten anymore. The professor paired us differently that week, thankfully. I was matched with a quiet, focused student named Ananya. Working with her was a relief. No drama, no fake charm, just clean science. For the first time in months, I actually enjoyed lab again. Meanwhile, Rohan was paired with someone else. I overheard the poor guy muttering to a friend, he didn't bring anything. I had to do the whole thing. I bit back a laugh. The cracks in his image were no longer small. They were wide open. That Friday, when reports were handed back, Ananya and I scored top marks. Rohan and his partner, on the other hand, got one of the lowest. A few students snickered. No one defended him anymore. At lunch, Neha leaned over and whispered, It's over. People have seen the truth. And she was right. The next day, something unexpected happened. As I packed up my bag after class, Rohan cornered me near the door. His smirk was gone. His eyes, usually so full of fake confidence, looked almost desperate. "You think you've won, huh?" he said, voice low. I didn't flinch this time. I met his eyes steadily. "I didn't win anything," I replied calmly. "You lost all on your own." For a moment, he looked like he might argue. But then, realizing nobody was paying attention to him anymore, he just scoffed and walked away. And that was it. No crowd, no laughter, no power left. That night, I sat with my notes spread across my desk, the silence of my room wrapping around me. I realized something I hadn't understood before. Rohan had only ever had the power I allowed him. The moment I stopped giving him space in my head, the balance shifted. The whispers, gone. The fear, gone. My confidence, back. The professor even called me aside after class one day. "You handled yourself well," he said. "Not many students would have kept their composure through that." I smiled quietly. His words meant more than he knew. By the end of the semester, Rohan was just another face in the hall. No more smirks, no more shadows, just background noise. And me? I wasn't the scared, shrinking version of myself anymore. I was stronger, more steady, more sure of my place. The lab had taught me more than chemistry. It had taught me resilience. It had taught me that lies eventually collapse under their own weight. And most of all, it had taught me that sometimes the best revenge is simply standing tall while the person who tried to bring you down falls all on their own. What was your favorite moment of her finally standing up to Rohan? The last lab of the semester felt different from the very first day. I walked into the room with my notebook under my arm and a sense of quiet confidence. No more dread, no more tension. I glanced at the empty bench where Rohan used to lounge, smirking at my work. He was still there in the class, but his presence no longer loomed over me. Ananya, my new lab partner for this session, smiled as we set up our equipment. Working together was smooth and easy, the kind of collaboration that felt natural, rewarding, and most importantly, fair. I felt the weight of the semester lift with every pipette drop, every careful measurement. I realized that my hard work had always been mine. It wasn't stolen, it wasn't diminished, and it couldn't be erased. During the lab, I noticed subtle changes around me. Classmates who had once avoided me now asked for help or quietly complimented my notes. It wasn't about them suddenly liking me. It was about them seeing truth in action. My reputation had shifted from snitch to someone dependable, competent, and confident. Rohan sat across the room, fidgeting with his notes, clearly struggling to keep up. He shot me a glance that seemed to mix frustration and regret, but I didn't meet his eyes. I had no need for that confrontation anymore. The power he thought he had over me was gone. After class, Neha caught up with me outside the lab. "You did it," she said simply. "You didn't let him drag you down, and now everyone sees it." I smiled, feeling the warmth of genuine support. It wasn't easy, I admitted, but I learned that standing your ground isn't about confrontation. It's about knowing your own worth. At the end of the semester, I reflected on everything. The stress, the isolation, the whispers, and the cold stares. They were part of a journey that taught me resilience, patience, and self-respect. I realized that being brave isn't always about shouting the truth. It's sometimes about quietly doing what's right and letting the results speak for themselves. When final grades were posted, I had not only passed with distinction, but also earned recognition from the professor for consistent effort and integrity. I walked across campus that day with a sense of pride that had nothing to do with others' opinions. Rohan's influence faded into background noise, a reminder of how petty power crumbles when met with steadfast honesty. I carried forward the lesson that the next time someone tried to manipulate, copy, or intimidate, I could handle it calmly, firmly, and with confidence. The lab had been more than just experiments and results. It had been a test of character, patience, and resilience. And I had passed, not just in chemistry, but in life. For the first time in months, I felt free to focus, to excel, and to be unapologetically myself. Do you think Rohan learned his lesson, or will he continue the same behavior elsewhere?